Hi everyone. My name is Benedikte. I'm very glad to be back here at EvoStar. I've seen a lot of interesting talks so far, and I'm excited to present my work to you today. So the work I'm here to talk about is focused on exploring common sampling strategies in the context of sequence prediction models and dance. So most generative models that learn some kind of probability distribution, they allow us to have some control over the sampling stage when the model is done training, and the opportunity to select tokens with more or less randomness. So in general, sampling from a trained model is typically quite an alchemy-like state, where we as AI practitioners play around, sort of tweaking temperature parameters until we find something that works for our specific task and data set. So take, for example, the task of predicting the next note in a melody based on a sequence of preceding notes. So often our sequence prediction models will aim to learn a probability distribution between all the possible next tokens. So here the task would be to find the likelihood associated with each of these 12 notes. So you might end up with something like this, where the height of each bar represents the likelihood of each note being chosen. And then the model learns what the most likely note is based both on the preceding notes as well as how often each of the notes appears in the training data. But a model that always predicts the most likely note will probably produce quite conservative and uninteresting things. So using a so-called greedy sampling strategy would here result in us picking the note F as the most likely. However, maybe choosing D, which is the second most likely note, would actually be more interesting. So to amend this, it's common to use a temperature parameter to reweigh this learned distribution in order to make it more likely that other notes are selected some of the time. So as I mentioned earlier, this step is often slightly shrouded in mystery, and so our aim with this work has been to approach this step with a little more thoroughness and systematically explore how altering certain parameters of our trained movement generation model would affect the output. So before I go further into details about these different parameters, I thought we'd have a closer look at the model that we used for these experiments and the data set. So the dataset is a collection of full body 3D motion capture recordings of dancers set to different musical stimuli. So some of these recordings are being animated here. And for these experiments, we'll not be concerning ourselves with the audio data, so only the movement data. The dataset contains 3 dancers improvising to 6 different musical stimuli, and they do 3 repetitions to each of the 6 songs, which gives us 54 examples in total. These are in turn sliced into overlapping sequences of 256 frames, which is equivalent to about 10 seconds of dance. And that gives us a total of approximately 80,000 sequences to train on. So the model that we're using here is a variant of a recurrent neural network. But instead of the recurrent layers directly estimating the position of the body at the next time step, the recurrent layers learn to estimate the parameters of a Gaussian mixture model. And this architecture is usually referred to as a mixture density recurrent neural net, or an MDRNN. So our model consists of 3 layers of LSTM cells, which are in turn connected to our mixture density network, which gives us our probability distribution. And the model is then fed a sequence of 3D positions for 22 different points on the dancer's body. And the model learns a distribution for each dimension of each of the 22 points at each frame. So we're not putting any constraints on the model here for where each of these points might be, but the movement data is normalized so that it makes the data invariant to global position, as well as individual body dimensions of the dancers. So in the early stages of training, this model learned these kinds of strange, shaky dances, wherein the hands and feet move almost in isolation. A possible theory for why this happens is that the model is picking up on changes in these areas, as a lot of movement does happen here. The model later learns to generate overall smoother movements, but it still generates examples that break with what is possible for the human body to do, like growing or shrinking at will. The current model is able to generate smooth and relatively realistic movements, although it does still have a tendency to sort of get stuck in certain repetitive motion. And this is where we get into the sampling strategies. So we can explore the model a little bit and see if we can get some interesting variations. So as opposed to the note prediction example that I gave, our MDRNN generates a slightly more complex output for us to play around with, namely a mixture model containing several probability distributions. So we sample from this distribution to get the position of each of the 22 points on the body. But as with the note prediction example, we can prod and pry and explore this distribution a little instead of only sampling from sort of the highest peak. So let's get back to having a look at the ways in which we can manipulate this sampling step and the movement variations that we can produce. So for this work, we opted to examine 3 common sampling strategies for sampling from a trained model. The first one we call primed sampling. So this is where we use an unseen sequence of movement to condition the network. Alex Graves explored this in his 2013 paper using MDRNNs to create handwriting, where he used it to generate writing with different example-specific idiosyncrasies. So instead of letting the model predict the next time step based on its own previous predictions, we instead feed it these overlapping sequences of an unseen test example and then accumulate its predictions. So we experimented with 2 different priming sequences. Both of them were withheld during training. One is an example where the movements of the dancer are quite slow and flowing, and one where the movements are faster and the performance is in general quite a lot more eventful. So we found similar results in both cases, shown here with a keyframe plot generated using the slow moving primer. It's a bit easier to sort of see what's going on when there's slower movements. So here we notice that the model does not predict precisely the same as the primer, but still the overall shape and timing of the movement is preserved. So we take this to indicate that primed sampling in particular might work well for creators who want to generate subtle variations on a movement theme while keeping the overall style the same. So the second strategy that we explored is that of adjusting sampling temperature, which is probably the most common approach with sequence prediction models that learn some probability distribution. So for the mixture density RNN, we do have, as I said, a few more options. This figure shows a simplified version of our learned distribution from which we sample the 22 3D positions of the body at the next time step. So our model uses 4 mixture components, but this is simply a hyperparameter, which we found to be suitable. You can have more mixture components or less, depending on the task. So in reality, our MDRNN is actually a 66 times 4-dimensional thing at each time step. So for readability, I've chosen this simplified version, which could, for example, represent the probability distribution for the position of one point. So for example, the ankle joint in a single dimension, for example, the X dimension, and at a single time step. So there are 2 parameters that we can adjust here to affect where in this landscape we're sampling from, and that is pi and sigma. So let's begin with having a look at what pi does. So the value of pi tells us about the height of each mixture component. So the higher it is, the more likely we are to sample from that region. And by adjusting pi, we can reweigh the probability distribution and thereby the likelihood of sampling from each of these 4 components. So a high pi temperature means that we adjust the height of each component to set them all equally high, which is equivalent to doing a random draw. So let's have a look at the results of sampling from the model with the pi temperature rising over time. So when pi temperature rises, we start sampling from different distributions at each time step. And what we found was that this causes the body to sort of jump from one pose to another, indicating that the components are not all learning the same thing. They're not learning variations of one thing. They're learning quite different things. So they've each sort of modeled their own possible future. And so jumping between them causes extreme changes in body position, which look quite unnatural. The other temperature adjustment we can do has to do with sigma. So sigma corresponds to the width of each component. And by increasing sigma, we allow for samples to be pulled from further away from the learned mean of each component. A low temperature means that we sample close to the mean, and a higher temperature means that we can sample a bit further away. So what we found was that sigma is quite a volatile parameter. A small increase can have quite a large effect on the animations. So allowing samples that are around 1 standard deviation from the mean can result in some interesting variations, but too far and things get a little bit crazy. So increasing sigma over time, we see that at sufficiently high temperatures, the movements become jittery. And at very high temperature, the body pose distorts into something which is almost sort of non-human. In general, our conclusions were that both pi and sigma value have quite a small range of viable values for generating movement. And one reason for this is that we are extremely sensitive to distortions in the human body. A small discrepancy quickly breaks realism. And so a larger range of values might be viable for other applications like music and sketch drawings, for example. And we've seen that in several cool works. So the final strategy that we had a look at is quite specific to the MDRNN, and that's simply isolating the mixture components. So when isolating a mixture component, we just disregard the learned pi value, or sort of the distribution of the different components. And then we just isolate it to a single component at each time step. So we disregard all others. So this allows us to explore a bit deeper the things that we saw when examining pi, sort of what is each component actually learning. So as I mentioned previously, we chose 4 mixture components for this model. And so we generate a sequence of movement from each of the components. So as expected, the component which had the highest likelihood or pi value learned the most realistic looking movement. And this is also the one that we'll sample from the most. At least if we do this sort of greedy sampling, we're just looking at the most likely next frame. When sampling from the second most likely component, we get movement sequences that are a bit more distorted, but they're still quite coherent and smooth. And they also do some interesting stuff that we might not see otherwise. Sampling from the final two components result in very little movement at all. And the movements that are generated look a bit painful. So I've lovingly nicknamed this one the ankle breaker, and I'm sure you can see why. And the least likely component generates quite impractical, if not impossible, feats of balance. So examining these components make it clear why allowing high temperatures of pi, meaning that we jump between components frequently, is not really a viable option for movement data, as the components generate such different outputs, even when given the same starting pose and with all other parameters kept the same. So our findings can be summarized into the following recommendations. Adjusting pi and sigma during sampling allows variations to be produced within quite a narrow band of useful values, and these need to be determined by trial and error. So there's still a little alchemy left here. Using new movement sequences to prime the model can ensure that the generated sequence follows the overall movement shape and style of the priming example. And by further combining priming and, for example, sigma temperature adjustments, one could produce several variations on a theme. Generating motion from individual mixture components seems to be a particularly useful tool, as we found some mixture components with lower learned weights can produce quite useful and interesting outputs. And isolating these components can ensure that they are not overwhelmed by more likely parts of the mixture model and thereby never really sampled from. So lastly, we also include a link to our working repository for these experiments. So if you want to have a look at the code and some more videos, then please feel free to check it out. In our future work, sort of for our next steps, where we have an ongoing study, which is a perceptual judgment survey to gather information on how the AI-generated dance is perceived. And I think it would also be interesting to do a similar thing for these sampling strategies as well, perhaps allowing people to tweak the parameters on the fly and then select the ones that they prefer. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. That's it for me.
Well, thanks for the presentation. We have obviously some time for questions, and I would suggest that if you have questions, please raise your hand. And yes, Yazin, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just was using the clapping emoji. I like the talk.
Oh, sorry.
No problem.
I have a question from João Cunha. João, if you want, you can.
Hey, João.
Yeah. Hi, Benedict. It's nice to see further developments from your work since ICCC. I'm curious. It's a weird question, but I was curious on the reaction of people to these movements produced by AI. How do they, I mean, I assume that you are showing these to people and have eventually people use these moments and movements and try them out. So what's their reaction? Do they find them weird or?
Yeah, it's I was lucky to have to present my work to a group of dance anthropologists at one point. And it was extremely interesting to see their reactions to this, because what happened was that these are dancers themselves, so it's almost like they are unable to watch any movement without trying it with their own bodies at the same time. So I could sort of see even over Zoom that they were sort of trying to replicate what the model was doing, and I think it very much depends on your background to a certain extent, how you perceive these. I think I initially maybe thought that people with a lot of dance background might be more skeptical or critical, but I've sort of found kind of the opposite. I got some cool ideas as to like why things might be happening that seemed obvious to them, but was not necessarily on my mind. Things like the model has a tendency to be quite right side focused, which for dancers makes sense in that they, if most of the dancers in my data set, this is not something I collected information on, unfortunately, but I can assume that most of them are right-handed. And so they will often lead with the right side. And that's something that it seems at least that the model is able to sort of pick up on. So yeah, I think it depends how people feel about the dances that are AI generated, but it's been very valuable to get feedback from all sorts of different people.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, Bill has a long question. Do you want to read that, Bill? Or do you prefer me to read it?
Yeah, please.
Oh, yeah, please. You really did that. Okay, so I'll try to read this to you, Benedict.
Okay.
What would be the effect of using possible geometry, for example, a fixed length and so on, to constrain the models? That would be the first question. And the second question, do you think there are practical medical applications, for instance, for Parkinson's diseases?
Yeah, that's very, very interesting questions. Thanks for that, Bill. I've definitely been looking into different data representations. So constraining the model more than I do today. There are some sort of pros and cons there. I'm interested in the creative capacity of this kind of model and AI in general. And so I felt like putting the least amount of constraints possible would sort of reveal what the model is actually capable of producing to a larger extent than if I put on very strict constraints. But since all the data is normalized so that they do all share the same leg length in the data set, like all the body dimensions are the same across all examples. But still you see the model sort of break out from these because I'm not constraining that in the output step. It might be interesting to try that out as well. I think it will sort of leave room, if nothing else, for the model to learn maybe more interesting things than just figuring out sort of the kinetics structure of the body and sort of those kinds of things. So that would be cool. For medical applications, I think that's obviously super interesting if that's possible. There's a lot of really cool work that uses motion capture to look at these things in that it's so precise. I was lucky enough to capture my recordings with this sort of full optical motion capture, 12 cameras. So it's extremely precise measurements. I can't think of any concrete medical applications as of now, but yeah, obviously that would be really cool if you have any ideas, send them my way. That would be awesome.
Okay, so I'm going to abuse my privileges because I want to make an additional question. For me, this appears to be an extremely interesting opportunity for co-creativity. So having some sort, for instance, I was thinking about the early work of Al Biles with Gen Jam, where he was improvising something, then there is a reply, or with Spectre also in music, there is a sequence of notes and then a reply by the system. Have you thought of something like that, of like a cooperative, co-creative something online? Does this make any sense to you, or am I
100%? No. Definitely. it's something I'd very much like to do, hopefully during my PhD, to have time to do something like that, do some more performance-based stuff. As of now, and this model that I'm using in this exact paper, it's quite big. Like, I think it's 8.5 million parameters or something that's used during training. So the real-time application of it it's a bit too slow. But I am currently working with a colleague of mine who is looking at both EMG data from these myo bands. I don't know if you're familiar with those that collect sort of muscle information. Yeah. As well as some motion capture and accelerometers, that kind of thing, and doing real-time co-creation from movement to sound. But that model it's still the MDRNN, but it's much smaller, so that it'll be able to sort of react properly in real time. I think that's the big bottleneck for this work. But I'm also trying out some different types of models. Hopefully I'll find something where I can do just that, because that's definitely been a motivation for me from the start.
Okay.